Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, we're at 1 minute past three now, so we'll get started. So today we're focusing on training effect, kind of what it is, what the two different parts of it mean, and giving some examples of how you can use it. Um, this is a metric that's unique to Firstbeat, so maybe something that not everyone's quite as familiar with, particularly if you're kind of new to what we offer and the different variables that we have. So yeah, the intention of this session is to kind of give you an overview, hopefully give you some inspiration on how you can use it alongside some of the other kind of more standard heart rate based measures and yeah, kind of maximize what you're getting from us. As before, there's the option to ask questions. I will, so if you use the Q&A option for that, I will take a look through those at the end if there are any, and we'll go through them at the end. So we'll probably be about 15 minutes or so. So yeah, plenty of time for questions at the end. Yeah. So for anyone who didn't join last time, just quickly introduce myself again. So spent kind of 7 years working in professional football at two different teams, and then have been at Firstbeat since 2017. Um, yeah, and so yeah, been here kind of 8 years now. My research background kind of specialized in heart rate variability and training load management. So yeah, so there we go. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about. But yeah, obviously if you have ideas or things that kind of you disagree with or want to question, then by all means kind of let me know. It's always good to sort of have that element of debate about what we have in here as well. So just to kind of run through what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, like I mentioned, I'll introduce what training effect is, um, give you a brief kind of overview of how they're calculated, a bit of an insight into why we believe you should be using it in your monitoring, and then yeah, a few kind of examples of different contexts in which you can utilize those variables and that data and get the most from your training and from your Firstbeat platform. So kind of kicking off with what is it? So the general gist and idea of training effect is to take all of the kind of complex heartbeat data that you collect over your training sessions and transform that kind of and condense it down into a really easy to understand format. As anyone who's kind of familiar with it already know, it's then presented on a 0 to 5 scale. So yeah, like super easy to kind of to get your head around and also for really easy to communicate to other stakeholders, whether that's other coaches, other conditioning staff, or even the players themselves, or even the athletes themselves, I should say. Um, and that's sort of some of the feedback we've had from numerous clients over the years is that it's really easy for communicating with players because it is just that 0 to 5. And yeah, so a nice, easy way to just communicate how difficult the session was because it can be quite hard to answer that from some of the other variables, particularly like the time-based ones that will just accumulate regardless of whether you're actually doing anything to an extent. Um, Broken down into aerobic and anaerobic components. And yeah, can kind of be determined by the system at any point within the session, so you can kind of get instantaneous feedback on what you're doing. And easily see if your training sessions are meeting the demands that you wanted. You would like be that live or when you're looking at the session afterwards. You can kind of loosely categorize it as shown on the right here. So anything up to 1 is kind of, or anything above 1 is kind of having a small effect. Anything above 2 is sort of maintaining the fitness levels that you have already. 3 improving, 4 kind of improving it quite significantly, and then 5 is called overreaching. Like one-off session isn't going to lead to overreaching, but if you're continually getting values of 5 or very high 4s, then you might then be at greater risk of kind of getting into an overreaching state. But so yeah, don't kind of worry too much about the fact that a rating of 5 is called overreaching. It just means it's kind of a really hard session in a one-off context. But If it was done repeatedly, then might lead to like some overreaching type, um, yeah, type impacts. So in terms of like how it's calculated, the specific calculations are kind of actually well above my head. So I won't try and kind of go through everything in full depth, but if you do want to read more, you can go to our website. I've put the address there. Navigate to the white papers section, and you can then read the full white papers with all of the relevant kind of more technical info. Um, but yeah, in the subsequent slides here, I'll kind of give you a slightly dumbed down explanation of what they are and yeah, how the two parts of it are calculated. But basically, it factors in the individual's heart rate response at any given point, and then the predefined activity class that you set in their profile. Again, I've not included the specifics of activity class because there's kind of a guidance within the profile setup, but it basically allows you to input the kind of performance level of that particular athlete. Um, in team sports, we would usually suggest or guide that you set everyone within your team the same, unless you've kind of got real reasons to differentiate anyone. Because although there will be individual differences within the group, in kind of the bigger picture, they're relatively homogenous and will all be more or less the same kind of standard and class of athlete. Um, in brief, the aerobic variant is based on epoch accumulation, and the anaerobic uses interval detection. And again, I'll go into a little bit more on the factors of those in subsequent slides. So first, the aerobic, like I've said, primarily uses epoch accumulation from a session, um, and that is kind of based on the current exercise intensity and the time spent at that intensity. So when your body is working beyond the points of the kind of the oxygen it can deliver, then that epoch will begin to accumulate. Um, and the peak value that you get from a session, so it may fall within the middle. So there's the kind of the second example on the right shows at the bottom, the peak value actually arrived at the kind of more in the middle of the session than towards the end because there was sufficient recovery in between those kind of work blocks. But the higher those peaks are, then that essentially means that the recovery demands are going to be greater. It will take longer to pay off that oxygen debt. So yeah, so that the session has therefore been harder. That's kind of the basics of it. But yeah, the higher the value, the harder the session, the longer it will take to recover. And then the anaerobic value takes in a few more factors. So it's essentially looking to identify any period of work throughout the measurement that is or that was anaerobic in nature. So yeah, I've kind of listed the main factors that are taken into account on this slide. So it will look at the peak intensity of the part of work. It will look at the interval duration. So um, how long is it? For example, like if you're kind of stretching into 2, 3, 4 minutes, then the bulk of that is going to be aerobic rather than anaerobic, while the earlier parts of that interval might be more likely to be anaerobic. The recovery periods and work rest ratios that have kind of already occurred. So that's using that to kind of figure out what opportunity there has been for resynthesis of ATP. Because if you're kind of constantly at high intensity, then you'll use up those stores early on, but then perhaps won't have the opportunity to recover them, which then reduces the amount of anaerobic work you can do subsequently. So that's kind of quite an important factor in particularly like later in the session as to whether you can actually be working anaerobically or not. Factors in the intensity, the starting intensity of the activity, and then also the heart rate gradient. So how quickly the heart rate increases, because this again is likely to indicate whether the body's working aerobically or anaerobically. Like if you consider you could be early on in a training session working at quite a low percentage of your heart rate max, but then if you put in a sudden burst of high intensity work, whether that's like a short sprint or something else, then your heart rate will increase very quickly, but may not get into like the higher percentages. So that's on more traditional sort of zonal based or just percentage max based models, that wouldn't show up as like a piece of high intensity work. But because the heart rate has increased so quickly, actually it is high intensity. It just hasn't got into the higher reaches of your heart rate. And then lastly, yeah, like what training time has elapsed and what fatigue will have accumulated over the session kind of again come into whether work later on in the session can actually be aerobic or anaerobic. Um, so yeah, all of those factors kind of get bunched in together, and the incredibly clever algorithms and that side of it work out what proportion of the work has been anaerobic. So in terms of why I think we think you should use this, it actually makes the data a lot more usable in kind of real life settings. So yeah, like traditional heart rate based stuff. So things like time in zones, particularly in team sports, can be quite hard to kind of get meaningful data from. So obviously high intensity is typically taken as like your higher red zone minutes. So depending on what kind of platform you're using, that might be anything above 90% or anything above 85%. But as described in the previous slide, work can be high intensity without getting into the sort of those maximal zones. But also you can maintain those really high percentages for a very long time. So it is very high intensity aerobic work, but not necessarily anaerobic work. So you can't really infer one or the other just from being in your red zone. So that's why utilizing the training effect is then actually really beneficial, because you can actually get a quantification of how much of the work was aerobic, how much was anaerobic, and get more of an insight into what you've done rather than just like the number of red zone minutes. And the second and third chart that you've got on the screen at the moment kind of give a really good example of that. So the middle of the two, or of the middle of the three, was from a rugby, or is from rugby. So longer kind of work periods, so higher red zone minutes, simply because the body's got more time to get up into those higher zones. Um, and then the bottom chart is from ice hockey, so very short work periods before they would then go off and rest. Overall training effect was broadly similar, 3.7 against 3.5. But then the ice hockey was much more anaerobic because they were having those recovery opportunities between their workouts. So then they were able to kind of increase those intensities quickly when they came back onto the ice. The percentages there are kind of from slightly older iteration of training effect, but I still like to use these particular charts because they give a really nice kind of illustration of the difference between utilizing something like red zone minutes or utilizing training effect when trying to establish like what pathways were being used within that particular activity. Another real benefit of it, or of training effect, is that it's kind of activity agnostic, and by that I mean you can use it across whatever kind of training modality you're using, whether that's field based for what like while you're on the actual pitch doing your real sport, whether that's football, basketball, hockey, whatever it is. But also when you're doing conditioning sessions that are maybe not directly the same. So that could be in the gym, on a bike, on a rower, or could just be running based sessions that aren't actually like directly sport based stuff. Um, and yeah, that means you can then be comparing sort of those different activities on the same basis, which makes tracking of your weeks, months, whatever kind of time period you're looking at much easier, because you can then see like the whole picture and factor in everything in every part of your training, rather than just looking at purely your field-based sessions, for example. And that also makes the decision making for things like conditioning and return to play or rehab much easier, because um, you can take the demands that your players would face in a game or a normal training session, and then actually try and match that within your other protocols. And I've got a bit more on that later, so I won't go into too much depth there. But yeah, in summary, kind of on this bit, the real beauty of it is you can use it for all of your activities. Whereas, yeah, things like if you're looking at distance or stuff like that, it kind of can be quite context specific. So one of the ways that I really like to kind of max or utilize it and again kind of suggest to our clients is using it for kind of putting together your sort of weekly periodization or your game to game periodization. Sort of, some people play more than or have games more than once a week. And it's a really nice, simple way to kind of structure your microcycles. So I've just put a couple of examples here. So the top chart is actually kind of an amount like a reference data taken from a load of teams, and it's giving the average. So, but it shows quite clearly how there is that differentiation between the weeks. So the two sessions, 3 days and 4 days before a game are typically the kind of most intense. And then tapering off into game day. And what this is really nice and shows really well is also the tapering of kind of the volume of the sessions. So you've got the trim depicted with the gold squares. So that decreases from 4 through to match day -1, but the intensity very slightly increases on match day -1, and that's often because those kind of sessions are used as a primer. So they'll be smaller, but they'll be slightly more intense to kind of get the players into match day mode, ready for their game day, and then the match day +1, +2 kind of typically or often you kind of top up or recovery sessions. So slightly broader spread on what's there, but yeah, it shows that kind of it does work in terms of using it for your weekly periodization. And then I've kind of got a hypothetical model showing at the bottom as to how you could potentially structure a week, depending on again your goals and the specific kind of way you do that and the way you and the models that you use. So like this hypothetical example is like you focusing more anaerobic work on the Tuesday, bit more aerobic, bigger areas on the Wednesday, and then again that taper into to the game day. But yeah, or even if you're just using like a really kind of simple polarized type model where you just want two hard sessions, two easy sessions, again, using training effect makes it super easy because you can see live, have we kind of reached the level that we want to? So you might define that you want on a Tuesday your players to reach a 4. Then you might say on a Friday or day before a game, you don't want them going above a 2.5, just as a throwing kind of slightly random figures out there. So don't necessarily take those as what you should be using. And yeah, it kind of gives you that really easy, see it live, snap one number to focus on, and it's yeah, really simple and gives you a way to kind of mix up that week without kind of trying to take in too many different factors. And then sort of following on from that kind of similar theme is looking at isolated sessions. Again, it's really powerful and really useful. You can quickly see kind of have you got or have you reached the desired outcomes? Do you need to make any adjustments? That could be live, sort of in real time if you're looking at the coach app or the monitor if you're still using that older hardware. Because yeah, like I said earlier, it's kind of calculated and available at any given moment within that training session. So if things aren't quite going to plan, or you've actually kind of perhaps maybe achieved more than you expected at that point of the session, you can then choose to make changes, make adjustments, or end the session kind of yeah to fit exactly what you need. And like I said, works both real time and post analysis. But again, just makes it super easy because you're only focusing essentially on two numbers rather than 5, 6, 7, which you can kind of then lose stuff in the detail if you try and look at too many different factors. And then kind of last example, as I touched on earlier, using it in conditioning and return to play protocols. A really good way to do that, particularly while players are off from their main sport. So they might, like I referenced earlier, might be in the gym, might only be able to cycle, might only be able to use a hand bike or a rower rather than being on their feet or out on the pitch. But rather than yeah, kind of just putting together sessions that you think might kind of keep them ticking along, you can be looking like, well, we know that on this day our team would typically do, I don't know, a session of 3.5. So you can plan to have achieve that within their conditioning sessions that they're doing away from the main training. And yeah, you're kind of going to get, although you're not going to get the kind of mechanical and skeletal demands you can still at least kind of try and match those metabolic demands so they're not losing sort of too much of their base fitness while they're away from the main sport. And then again, it can be used for periodization. So similar to what we spoke about previously with the microcycles, you can use it for sort of planning their longer term progressions, particularly those that might be out for extended periods. If they've been out for a really long time without any activity, you can kind of go back to almost those sort of basic kind of periodization principles of working on the aerobic before factoring in the higher intensity. So build up one, then build up the other. Um, so the kind of the screenshot I put at the bottom is sort of again a rough indication of how you might plan it. So gradual build of the intensities in those first four sessions, then drop off to allow that bit of recovery, then a bit of a build up again, and then sort of two slightly different variants at the end. And it's again comes back to communicating with the players. It's really easy to communicate. We're going to build you up from a 2.5 through to a 4.5. And then we're going to factor in more anaerobic stuff and kind of build you up that way. And it just super easy. Really nice way to plan it out without, again, having to kind of stress too much about too many kind of different individual components. And then just one kind of side note on the end there, it's always, even more so perhaps in like return to play, it's really useful or really important to use like the quick recovery testing. So I won't go into any detail on that here, but I think the webinar after the next one is focusing on QRT, so you'll be able to get a bit more insight there. But yeah, really useful to use that kind of make sure that they're coping with the demands that you're placing upon them and can then adjust the plans if they're struggling or if they're doing better than expected. You can kind of perhaps potentially push them a bit harder if the like the medical kind of side allows you to do so. So if they're kind of physically, medically fit, then you can make adjustments as required based on kind of how they're coping with the demands and ramp up quicker, ramp down slower, like, make the adjustments as you go. So in summary, just to kind of give an overview of what we've done. So we've gone over what training effect is, how we calculate it. You can use it to gain actual real usable information into your training sessions and the demands that the players are facing and what that has kind of what areas of their fitness have been developed. Also really good for microcycles, planning those, easy to assess your sessions, and then a great way to use kind of to use within your conditioning and return to play programs. And I've actually realized we've gone a bit slightly longer than I anticipated. We're now at 24 minutes past, so I'll skip on to the questions that we've got. And if I can answer those, I will do. We've got a few, so we might not have time here to get through all of them. But if we don't, then we'll kind of follow up via email with those. So just bear with me one moment while I just quickly read through those. Okay, so the first question, so which cases would I regard training effect more useful as a metric than TRIMP and vice versa? So TRIMP is a better measure of like overall training load and better to use for longitudinal monitoring. So kind of keeping track of like chronic loads and acute loads and sort of how much they're doing over time and how that side is progressing. Whereas training effect is probably more useful on a single session basis. So kind of assessing, like I've said, what they've done within a single session or what you plan to do within a single session rather than I wouldn't suggest trying to like add it up or total it over a week or that kind of thing. So TRIMP more beneficial for like overall load and longitudinal monitoring. So next question, would it make sense to determine maximum intensity periods for training effect? No, in short, because you can't separate out certain bits for the training effect within a measurement because it accumulates over the whole duration. What has already happened influences what happens kind of next. So you can't really break it down into smaller parts. Then there's a couple of sort of subsequent points on that, but I think that kind of already answers it. So it is different to maximum intensity periods, and because you like I say, you can't break it up. within a session really, because yeah, what's already happened has quite a significant impact or can have a significant impact on what happens next. So then we've got is training effect mainly for cardio workouts than weight training. Yeah, it's probably you're probably more looking at fitness, yeah, sort of field based or actual kind of cardiovascular than weight sessions for utilizing training effect because the work intensities and various like the way they're structured is very different. That's not to say you couldn't use training effect for weight sessions, but it might not show a huge amount of effect because yeah, normally you're kind of not working for a particularly long period before then you've got your rest periods. But yeah, there's no reason you couldn't use it. It just might not show a huge amount. Um, so next question, by using something like an increase in training effect per minute, would that be practically the same as trim per minute? It would probably show similar, but again, just it's very difficult to isolate out those points because what has happened previously kind of has an impact. So depending on how the session is structured and what you've done already would kind of impact increases in training effect. So you could do sort of two very similar point or two very similar intervals, but yeah, depending on sort of the state of the body already, they might not have equally proportional increases in training effects. So trying to establish it kind of on a per minute basis is probably not likely to work very well. Then final question. So would I be able to show how training effect is calculated? An easy example. Not really. I would refer you back to the white papers to kind of re read those and see how it's calculated. It's not like something you can boil down into a simple calculation. Um, but yeah, the kind of the simplest we can get is it's as epoch accumulates, basically, if we're talking about aerobic or yeah, the anaerobic one is kind of as those intervals accumulate. So yeah, there's not like an easy kind of formula we can show. But yeah, I would just refer you to the white papers and suggest you have a look at those. They're not super complex in kind of how they're worded. So I think if you read those, you can hopefully get kind of an appreciation on how they work. And yeah, how the calculations work. So yeah, that's probably the best course of action for that one. Um, yeah, so that's the final question. Thank you everyone for listening. I hope that was helpful. Obviously, if you do have any follow-up questions, you think of anything later on, then by all means drop myself or just us generally an email and we'll get back to you. Like I said, this has been recorded, so you can watch it again, and then hopefully we'll kind of see you all in about a month's time for the next session. Thank you.